want to welcome you all to our lecture this evening on Mother Teresa and the virtue of compassion, talking a bit about the problem of suffering and how we respond to that. This is the fifth lecture in this series now, where we've been looking at great people and particular virtues that they exemplify. We have only one more after this, and that's Cardinal Newman, and talking about the intellectual virtues. Well, we have to start out tonight, I think, in pretty heavy fashion. It's sort of been a heavy time for me in preparing this lecture, I suppose. You know, there's not really a good biography out about Mother Teresa. There is one going to be out soon by a woman who I happen to know from New York, Eileen Egan, and I was on the phone all over the country trying to find her and find the book, and wasn't able to do that, and found out it's because she hasn't finished it yet. But she did give me a little bit of her time to tell me a bit about her research. But Mother Teresa has not wanted a biography done of her, and there really isn't one available, and it's awfully hard to pin down just the facts about her life, and even more to get any sort of critical sense of what she is about. So we sort of have to work tonight with stories, and which perhaps are not all that substantiated, and without really a way of critically assessing this woman. The real heaviness, though, in the preparation came, I think, in looking through a lot of the books that are available, which begin to give us pictures of what it's like where she labors in Calcutta, surely one of the poorest places in the world. We talk a lot about suffering and starvation and people in difficulty, and probably we've all touched into that a little bit ourselves. We've perhaps been with people who are dying, and perhaps we have know a bit about poverty in our own country and so on. But to begin to look at these pictures and hear these stories about Calcutta is just sort of overwhelming. It is there that they tell us that there's something like 1 million people who are born on the streets and live their whole life on the streets and die on the streets. Then you begin to see these pictures of these people and so on. So it really is a grim kind of world that we are having to face tonight. Human suffering. It's part of, I suppose, what grabs us deepest within. Suffering is the great mystery of life in a way, isn't it? I mean, so much we can handle and take care of, but it gets down to this ultimate kind of physical pain and alienation and mental anguish, and it becomes something that isn't a problem that can be solved. It can't just be parsed out and analyzed logically. It has a bigger power than that. It is what we often call the mystery of evil in our world. It sends our minds reeling, and we're thrown back on ourselves, and we're searching for answers in some way, and yet they don't easily come. One ought not speak glibly about the kind of suffering we're talking about tonight. One can't just toss it off or say in easy phrases how to handle it and so on. I think we have to be careful of that throughout the whole lecture. We're in front of a mystery here, and there is a proper reticence in that, in the face of that terrible reality of evil and suffering in our world. Now, one way of thinking of a response to all of that is what we commonly call pity. Pity has this notion that, in a sense, we are in a privileged position, and therefore we sort of look down on those who are less fortunate than we are. Pity is taken from a stance of superiority in one way or another. I was thinking of that phrase, I don't know quite what to do with it, "There but for the grace of God go I." And I must say, I guess I've probably used that phrase positively and thought it within my own mind and heart, and somehow after doing the preparation tonight, that phrase takes on more of a negative feel for me than it ever had before. "There but for the grace of God go I" sort of suggests this position of superiority that perhaps we assume in relationship to the poor, the oppressed, the down and out, and so on. So pity is what has led people with great resources, I guess, to what we call philanthropy. That is, out of that position of superiority, sort of doling out in one way or another to those who are less fortunate. Perhaps the healthy doling out some kind of help to those who are weak and suffering, sick, ill, and so on. So pity is not what we're talking about tonight. I'm using pity as a way of trying to define compassion eventually. But for now, pity I want to present as sort of a negative outlook on those who are less fortunate than we are, if we can still use that phrase. There's another thing that comes perhaps as a result of encountering intense suffering like this. And perhaps that has to do with what we call commonly sentimentality. To get overly sentimental about those who are suffering. Sentimentality, I think, is characterized by the fact that we feel bad about it. It tears up our guts to be in the presence of this kind of suffering. Sentimentality puts the emphasis on us and how it makes us feel bad, even to the point where we're more concerned about how bad we feel about it than about the fact that these people are suffering. Someone has talked about sentimentality as involving the depoliticizing of our feelings. In other words, that sentimentality takes it out of the public realm, out of the realm of action where we can do something about suffering, and throws it back on ourselves and say, boy, don't I feel bad about all of this. It's sort of a wallowing around in one's own self-pity, worrying about the way that makes me feel. I go back to a phrase that I heard from one of my students one time when I was asking students, why aren't people more involved in the movements anymore? And my student said something like, well, hey man, that tears my guts up to encounter racism, to encounter these great social problems. That tears me up, and I can't take that. I can't stand that. The emphasis is again on what it is doing to us as we observe the suffering in the world. Sentimentality very often leads to a certain passivity. Many people feel as though that our American culture stirs up sentimentality through the popular magazines, through the treatment of things on TV. Some of the people feel that way about parading youngsters on TV who are ill, deformed, so on, that it calls forth a sentiment, a sentimentality that perhaps is not a healthy one, that puts it back on how bad that ends up making the viewer feel. It really plays, I suppose, to a sense of guilt very often, that this guilty kind of attitude that would lead one then perhaps to give or to help in some way. One wonders how healthy it is to contribute that way simply out of a sense of guilt. Well, I suppose the person who has most been upset with this sentimental kind of pity in the history of philosophy and so on is Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century philologist and sort of philosopher and critic of the culture and so on. Nietzsche identified pity, sentimental kind of pity as I'm describing it, with Christianity. He's one of the few people in history who really thought that Jesus of Nazareth was a weak person. And most people who don't like the church and so on say, well, good for Jesus. We like him. He was good, but the church is bad. But Nietzsche is one of the few critics in history who felt that Jesus himself was off the track. And because he saw him as one who was sort of wallowing in this pity, identifying himself with the lowly who were around and with suffering. In fact, he says, this suffering of the Nazarene, it's overdone. It produces a strange kind of instinct in people, he said, to to sort of be miserable. We talk about that today in terms of inflicting pain on ourselves, a certain masochism. And Nietzsche felt that Christianity therefore denied life, denied the fulfillment of life, because it centered so much in on the cross and the terrible, horrible sufferings of the Nazarene, Jesus, and of this sort of wallowing around in misery. Many people have equated that or sort of moved in that direction with the whole sadomasochistic tendencies in human sexuality. See it in terms of domination, of control, of putting down, of one having to suffer and one having to inflict pain on the other. Something that perhaps is more prevalent in our culture than we would really like to think, and may well have roots in this kind of sentimentality that we're talking about. Well, I suppose in all these ways we end up seeing poor responses to this question of human suffering, this mystery of evil and human physical hurting, pity, sentimentality, weakness, inaction, so on. Now, I would like to use Mother Teresa as a way of countering all of that and putting her up, I suppose, as a sort of ideal of the personally compassionate individual. So we start her story back in 1910 with her birth of Albanian parents in what is currently Yugoslavia. Agnes Boyaju, as Eileen Egan at least told me how to pronounce it, if that's right. Maybe someone in here knows better. But this young girl of 12 years old heard a missionary from India talking about his work there and was really taken by that, fired by this idea that she wanted to be a missionary in India. And I think it was about when she was 18 years old, 17, 18 or so, the same missionary came back to her hometown again, and she was able to hear him talk once more and was really fired with this idea that she wanted to become a sister, and she wanted to somehow go and help those poor people in India. So she went to Dublin, Ireland, and joined the Sisters of Loretto, and went through the normal training procedure, went to India and so on, and made her final vows, and began to teach in a school there that is pretty nice. I was looking at some of the pictures of it. It's clean, well-scrubbed, probably fairly well-to-do people sent their kids there. At least that's the impression I get. And she was teaching in that school and became the principal of that school. I think she did that something like 9 years or so. And then something happened to her while she was on the train. She had that strong experience, she calls it the day of inspiration, when she was touched by the Lord, called by God, had the Spirit moved within her, that she really needed to do something more with the poor, to help the poorest of God's children. And she, I guess, wrestled a bit with that and tried to come to terms with it, to figure out what to do with all of that. And she ends up petitioning the bishop there to get her out of that order, which he saw, I guess, too enclosed in their nice, neat setting. And so she could work for the poor. She had to get permission from the Pope and the head of her order, and went through all of that. Eventually, she got that permission to move out and to start working with these poor people directly. One of the stories is that her room in that convent she had was looking over the city, and that when she used to look out there all the time and see all these street people laying there ready to die, that she was moved with great pity, that perhaps that's one of the things that contributed to this moment of inspiration that she had. Well, then Agnes goes out and does this, begins to help these visitors. She collected young children to try to help them. She thought she would teach them and so on. And she began to get more involved in the poor in the city. And at one time, the story goes, she was going along and she found this old woman laying in a rubbish heap. which is not unusual, being her feet had been eaten off by the rats and so on, and she was in terrible shape. And as the people would be there, I mean, human beings are just thrown out there. Like, people would walk by and think nothing of all of that. And she would come and she picked this woman up, took her to the hospital, insisted that they try to do something for this woman, and they wouldn't do it. And she really, the tenacious kind of person, she stayed with it. And finally, I think if I have the story right, finally got them to admit this woman. But what it did was put in her mind the need to help these people who were dying there. So it became part of her apostolate, therefore, to go out and find these people dying on the street. Someone gave her an attic, a couple of rooms, and she would take them into those rooms and try to care for them, doing that personally and so on, washing their wounds, getting them ready to die. Most of those people she would find like that would be so near death that they would die soon after she would bring them in. She used to take some of the young women that she had taught in the school out on little journeys through the slums. And in doing so, she would interest them in that kind of work, ask them if they wanted to help with that, would their parents mind if they did that, and if the young women were ready and so on, that she would have them come to her. Before long, she had 10 or 12 of these people, and that began the order then. The sisters, the group that she herself founded, the Missionaries of Charity. So, somewhat of this founding of the order, of course we know that spreads and so on from there, and eventually there was a group of men founded also, and we've got them all over the United States. They got houses here in the United States and so on. One of the things that she insisted on in all of this, and still insists on in her own life, is that there is this personal care for the poor, that she didn't just go out and find them or take them someplace else, but she would do all of this care themselves. They have houses for lepers. They have the houses where they take care of the little children, houses where they take care of the dying. And, you read these things about the terrible stench that's connected there, and all of the sisters are just devoted to cleaning those wounds themselves and taking care of those people in a very hands-on, close kind of way. Well, perhaps that's enough of the first part of Mother Teresa's story. I suppose that's somewhat familiar to people. She's, of course, still alive today, has received all kinds of awards and so on. We'll tell some more stories about her as we go along, but maybe that at least sets the tone for looking at this whole idea of compassion. Because I think that Mother Teresa really represents a whole other thing that's different from pity and sentimentality, and is something that we could put forth as compassion. The word compassion comes from two Latin words, the cum passio, which means to suffer with, to be present to. It's just the opposite, really, of standing aloof from or above somebody else and saying, there, but for the grace of God go I. Now, I can help these people. It takes the opposite viewpoint, that one is able to learn from the poor. That's something Mother Teresa repeats over and over. The poor do so much for us. The dying help us. They allow us to be charitable. They teach us about life and about dying. She constantly tells her sisters that, and she fights so that no other attitude can creep into her order. She really fears that, and she insists that they all work regularly themselves with these poor people, and to do so with a certain joy. Well, I'll save that and use it as response to sentimentality. Here I'm trying to see compassion, suffering with, being with. Someone has said, it's a very good book on compassion, by the way, by Matthew Fox, Spirituality of Compassion. On your bibliography there, you see that. It's very interesting. For a long time, no one wrote about compassion. At least if you read in the journals or the books, there was no books about compassion. Suddenly, in the last few years, it's become a central topic. Monica Helwig has written a fine book on Jesus as the compassion of God. Henry Nouwen's collaborated with a book on compassion. So more and more now we're seeing that idea coming out, and people claiming that we ought to give it a centrality in life, that it ought to be a key to what Christianity is all about. So it is, first of all, a matter of being with and not looking down upon others. And part of the being with is to be able to learn from, and then I started to say before, Matthew Fox tells us that one of his criteria is then, could one celebrate with these people? Could one take some of their joy and rejoice with them? Could an individual sort of maybe socialize with those people as one of the tests of whether one has achieved compassion over against mere pity? I said about joy, one of the things that Mother Teresa looks for in her women and admitting them into the order is this capacity for joy. I mean, she insists that they not be down about all of this suffering that they encounter, but there be an upbeat spirit to the kind of service they bring to others. She insists on a certain emotional and psychological maturity in the women who join her order, that they will be able to interact with others on that basis. There is a great sort of practical character to this woman. When visitors there go in where they're taking care of all these people, they're reminded or somehow feel the lack of sentimentality there. The suffering is a part of life. I mean, there aren't people die, and there aren't really a lot of tears shed. Death is just an ordinary way of life there. I mean, people are dying of these things all the time, and they don't seem to make a big deal out of it. What they are insistent on is that, indeed, these people have a moment of love in their life before they die. There's not a lot of thought of keeping them alive. I mean, there's not much they can do. Sometimes people recover and so on. But their whole thing is to let them die knowing that someone loved them, someone cared for them all their life, living on the street, all their whole life, no one ever doing anything. They have these marvelous stories of people who will be brought in and just a few hours later will die, but will die saying a kind word or with a smile and so on. But there's little of this sentimentality. You see, for her, compassion led to action. She had to do something. She had to get involved in what was going on, help these people, and in a very down-to-earth kind of way. The words that people use to describe her often have that kind of character. Practical, sort of stubborn in a way, hard-headed, and insisting on this real care and concern on a personal, individualized kind of basis. When we begin to look, I think, at compassion in this way, we see it as really a strong virtue, as a result of conviction and faith, of something that's allowed these people to overcome the natural tendencies of life. I mean, she once said something like this. A person came up to her and said, "I wouldn't touch those lepers like you do for $1 million. Mother Teresa said, "Either would I." Oh, either would I. I would do it only for the love of the Lord. Not for $1 million I do it. Only for the love of God would I do this. It becomes, it seems to me, an extremely strong virtue, one that one could think of as being at the center of life. People have often heard me talk about the center of the spiritual life as being something like self-acceptance. And I really believe that's true, and I think that is crucial. But when you start to put compassion at the center of the spiritual life, you get a little different flavor. You get a very active, involved, caring, passionate kind of sense of what the Christian life would be all about. I see it, therefore, as a strong virtue. I think that Nietzsche knocked the meekness of Jesus. I don't think he really understood what Jesus was all about. I don't think he saw the strength of character, the discipline that went behind his life. the power it took to be obedient to the will of the Father, the courage it took to go to Jerusalem despite the fact that he knew he would encounter the establishment there and likely be killed. There is, I think, a strength in going to the cross and not a weakness. Could have gotten away from all of that. It probably would have been seen in retrospect as the coward's way, where from our viewpoint it is a heroic kind of virtue that he exercised. So against Nietzsche, one would think that indeed this is a strong virtue. I think it's Erickson who said something about talking about the sadomasochistic tendency in sexual relationships, that somehow that is indeed built into the human situation, but it could be overcome only through love, only through care, only through compassion, a sense of being with. Again, I would think that compassion would be a way to deal with that very prevalent tendency in our culture, and perhaps something that's really seems almost built in to our cultural male-female stereotyping that we all sort of drink in. I'm of the opinion that Mother Teresa really had a solid theology that goes with all of this. A simple theology, and yet one that makes a lot of sense to me. She said something like this, that communion is very important to her. The Eucharist is crucial. She wouldn't let her sisters go and start a group anyplace if there couldn't be a priest there to provide Mass and the chance to go to communion. Absolutely crucial to them. Same way with the prayer life. They get up early in the morning and pray for an hour and a half before they go out and do this other work. And out to the streets, finding the dead, dying people and the children and bringing them in and nursing them and so on. And then again at night around 7 o'clock, everyone's got to be back to pray for an hour again. She was saying to somebody, she says, well, you know, we do this. You know, we realize that the busy people in the world don't have time to pray like that. But for us, you know, this is an essential part of what we do. Someone said how characteristic of her to look at it in that way. Here are these people killing themselves, reaching out to others. And here's this woman somehow, you know, saying that this is so important to us, this Eucharist and this prayer life. What I started to say was, her great statement is that if you can see Jesus under the appearances of the bread, then that will enable you to see Jesus under the appearances of those suffering faces that she encounters in the streets of Calcutta. That's an interesting kind of link-up, isn't it, between Eucharistic piety and life, isn't it? See, one of the keys to her whole theology is Matthew 25. That is, where Jesus identifies himself with the poor. Over and over, with the thirsting, the hungering, the homeless, the imprisoned, and so on. There I was. That was me you were doing that too. And Mother Teresa is over and over, that's the idea. She is reaching out to Christ. When she's picking the maggots out of the wounds of these people, she is saying to herself, she's doing that for Christ. And if she sees him on the appearances of bread, it's a hard thing to do to begin with, why that helps her to see Jesus under the appearance of this terrible misery and suffering. Yeah, I think there really is a sort of solid theology here that she's got of the resurrection of Christ, Christ's identification really with all of the poor people in the world. You know, when we're looking at this whole idea of the theology, it's an interesting parallel in Luke's Gospel and Matthew's. We very much picked up on Matthew's Gospel in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus finally says, "Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." We picked up on that, and we've almost made that like a moral crusade, like we interpret it in a moral way. We've got to do all of these things in order to become perfect, so we can sort of look at God and say, hey, God, I'm really neat. The parallel passage in Luke, I don't know if you've ever adverted to this or not, doesn't say that. It says, Be compassionate as your heavenly Father is compassionate. And someone has suggested, wouldn't it be interesting if we could take compassion and place it in the place of perfection and reinterpret the drive for perfection in terms of compassion? In fact, it puts us of a mind that Matthew probably didn't mean the way I described it, like do all these morally good things and build up merit, has something more to do with being true to oneself and being in tune with the well springs of one's strength that one gets from the Father. But be compassionate as your Father is compassionate, says Luke. If that was in the center, we'd probably have a lot less of this moralizing, a lot less of people feeling down on themselves, feeling like they're failures in life because of this striving for perfection. It seems to me it would change the mentality. Not that we would say, goody, I'm all as compassionate as I can be. Not that, but it would set a different tone for the whole business. It would put it much more in a social context to begin with, a relational context. It wouldn't be just me getting myself perfect. It would be right away, how can I be with others? How can I suffer with others? How can I actively reach out and help others? Very different way of beginning to think of what is central to the whole Christian life. I think there really is a solid theology there. Monica Hellwig has written that book entitled Jesus, the Compassion of God, in which where she brings us to mind all of the ways in which Jesus functioned compassionately. In the New Testament, I think there's 12 times where it says that Jesus stirred in his guts, moved in his bowels. There's sort of a literal translation. I guess we would say touched in the center of our being or moved in our guts. Responded to the persons who were hurting. The story of the widow of Nain, I think, is a good example of that, where Jesus, the widow has lost her son who has died. And that's how Jesus responds. You get a picture of Jesus, the miracle worker, not as one who's going to show these great signs, break the laws of nature, to prove to people he's God, but you get a picture of Jesus, the compassionate one, moved in his guts by the suffering he sees and sort of on an ad hoc basis responding to that with a healing touch. You can do a whole theology around this. I've just sketched out some of that for you. Meister Eckhart said, I get the quote right, something about you can call God loving and you can call God good, but the best name for God of all is the God of compassion. 14th century mystic Meister Eckhart. God is a God of compassion, the very best name that one can come with God. We talk about Emmanuel, God with us. That's what frames Matthew's gospel again, God with us. Jesus is called Emmanuel, it says at the beginning of that gospel. At the end we see Jesus saying, then I will be with you all days. So what kind of a picture do we get of God here through Jesus? Not one who's up above suffering and saying, I'll give her a tough one. I'll let him off easy. I'll test him now to see how strong he is. That's not the picture that comes across. You don't even get a picture of God allowing evil, like sitting on, I'll allow it to all happen. In this picture, we get a God with us who enters into the suffering process. When he comes on the earth, he takes on all the suffering of human existence. Does it himself, lives out the suffering. If indeed there is compassion, not pity, our God doesn't pity us, our God is compassionate with us because he comes and shares all of that with us. So I think Mother Teresa represents here a very healthy notion of personal compassion. Does it in her own life. A woman who's worn herself out in this. One time, she often won't receive medical help. She's sort of a stubborn woman like that. And they want her, one time I think they forcibly had to take her to a nursing home and force her to stop for a while and recuperate a bit and get her health back. Worn herself out in this whole struggle. to help the poor. And as such, she's become a saint in many people's minds. She's become, I suppose, the most well-known Christian figure today, at least in the top couple, the one who sort of represents what the good life is all about, one who's inspired thousands of other people to go and do the same thing, to give of themselves. Isn't that amazing how this woman has done all of that? And without much planning, very often, without figuring out she's going to found an order and get it to spread, just because she thought she ought to be with those who are suffering, be with the poorest of the poor, and to reach out to them. Well, let's stop there and see what we can learn a little bit about the virtue of compassion. I invite you to talk to the person next to you for a couple minutes now and see what in all of this most affects you, what touches you, what can you get out of it. All right, we'd like to look now at Mother Teresa perhaps from a little different angle. A fellow by the name of Dick Ryan, who writes for the Daily News in New York, once wrote a critical column about Mother Teresa in which he said that he had done a tremendous disservice, that she is doing a tremendous disservice to the sisters in the United States, that she has sort of been put forward as the model of Christian charity, and that thereby she has sort of put down those who have labored long and hard in other ways to try to help the poor and the sick and the oppressed in our world. Well, they said it was about like attacking motherhood or American values. I mean, I guess his mail was terrific, and they got him on the talk shows right away, along with another sister who sort of had that same idea, and they were expanding this whole critique of Mother Teresa, talking to people in the United States as though, I mean, they didn't do anything for the poor, talking about the importance of that people had to continue to wear the proper religious garb and so on, and sort of becoming a heroine for reactionary kind of people, and saying that, yeah, those who don't want to mess with the status quo, don't want to attack structures and systems, they put up Mother Teresa as an ideal, as someone who they can live with, and so that's wonderful. She's taking care of all these poor people, and at the same time she's not rocking the boat in any way. That she becomes, therefore, in his mind, a force of reaction in the world. Well, when I was preparing this talk, I called a friend of mine, a sister, and said, you know, I can tell by some comments you've made that you don't like Mother Teresa in some way, and I want to know why. Well, she wouldn't admit it at first. But after a while, indeed, she did get around to saying that indeed that critique that I didn't tell her about what was in the Daily News, but many of the same themes came out in response to this phenomenon of Mother Teresa. That sort of the suggestion that it's a one-sided model of what compassion really is all about. Feeling being that it neglects the systemic, the structural, the institutional side of the problems of evil in our world. Let me just tell you a couple stories about Mother Teresa, and then I want to read you a few quotes along this line where she comments on this kind of question, I think. One of the stories Eileen Egan told me, I says, tell me a story that isn't published any place that you know about her so I can tell my class about that. And she says, well, I have one for you. She says there was this really rich guy in India who was sort of living the easy-go life and so wasn't worrying about social justice or anything. But in encountering Mother Teresa, his whole consciousness was changed. You know, he suddenly wanted to do for the poor. and everything. So he came to her and offered her, I wasn't told how much money, but this unbelievable sum of money that he wanted her to put in the bank and draw the interest on it to help the poor. Oh, and that at times when the order got in big trouble and so on, that then they could draw on this and sort of save their situation, help themselves and so on. They could help all these poor. And Mother Teresa looked at him and said, no, I won't take that money. I won't take that money. Says, it isn't right to have that much money in the bank while all these people are starving to death. Another story about Mother Teresa. I think it was earlier on in her career. It's told by a friend of hers who gave, Michael Gomes, who gave her, I think, some of her property and has been a benefactor all along. And Mother Teresa came to him one day and she says, we've got a government grant for 33 rupees a day for these kids that are in this home here that we're taking care of. Government is going to give us that to help care. And she was sort of happy about this. She told Michael Gomes about this. And Michael said to her, he says, that's wonderful. He says, now we're going to have a committee and so on to make sure that we are keeping up with government regulations and so on. And her characteristic response was to say, well, that's all right, we'll get a small committee and we don't have to worry much about it and we'll take that money from the government. The way Michael Gomes tells the story, 6 months later, Mother Teresa came back to him and all smiles and joyful as usual and says, I refuse the grant from the government. Because they want us to, they're demanding that we spend 33 rupees a day on each of these children. And she says, to tell you the truth, we do it for 17 rupees a day. And it somehow just doesn't seem fair, and therefore we're not taking any of that money. Let me read you some quotes, Mother Teresa, about this particular problem. I think at one point she said, this is so characteristic, I think, of her own piety. She says, she puts great stress on the individual. She says, I never think in terms of a crowd, only of one person. If I visualized a crowd, I would never get started. What matters is the individual person. And I'm sure that that's exactly the way she has structured her own piety. That's the way she has taught all of her sisters. It is that one individual that counts, and that becomes that tremendous sense of personal compassion that she is able to keep going with. Let me read you another quote from her. If anyone feels that God wants him or her to change structures in society, that is a matter between God and that person. We all have the duty to serve God where we are called. I feel called to help individuals, to love each person, not to interest myself in institutions. I do not feel like judging and condemning. And then finally, trying to paint this picture here at an institutional level. India needs technicians, scientists, economists, doctors, and hygienists for its development. It needs plans. It needs a coordination of general action. In the meantime, people need to live. As long as the present lasts, our work continues to be useful and necessary. Her work being the ministering to the children and to the dying and so on. So some people have charged her, with not being pragmatic. One of the things I guess that those hospitals in those cities do is they will only take the people into the hospital if indeed they think they can help them. Mother Teresa's idea is altogether different. She wants to look for the worst off of all and be able just to comfort them in these last minutes before they die, so they will know the peace of a human smile and so on. Well, all of that is by way of setting the stage for this institutional kind of problem. I want to do a little more analysis of this before I try to respond to all of that. That much by sort of setting the stage for it. seems to me that when we begin to look at the world of suffering, a full picture of that demands a sense of institutional, structural, and systemic, what we call these days social sin. The way sin gets embedded in institutions, the way situations are created that necessarily keep people in bondage, that doesn't allow people scope for their own freedom. Talk about that hellish circle of poverty that our popes have mentioned. People caught in that with seemingly no way to get out of it. It just seems like one cannot look at the situation in the world today without doing a... And part of the response, I suppose, I want to make to Dick Ryan and to my friend who was commenting on Sister Theresa is that I'm not sure that it's her fault that she becomes the sort of symbol of reactionary responses, but the problem is that the picture gets limited, that it isn't filled out with another kind of social analysis that seems necessary and important for a full picture of what compassion is all about. Because the thesis of my second half of this presentation is that there must be a political and economic dimension to the virtue of compassion in the modern world, especially a world in which we know so much about systemic evil. And I mean, that's the way it is, isn't it? We see those statistics, that we are 6% of the world's population, consuming like something like 30-some% of the resources. We begin to get a feel for the vast numbers of people in our world who have no way out, who have no opportunity for any kind of social justice. The inequities of the society. And then we look within our own culture and we see, the tremendous rate of black teenage unemployment. I remember riding on the bus in San Francisco and twice in a week being attacked by these kids who would get on the bus and snatch purses. And one time they surrounded our bus and took the trolley thing off. And there was a moment, I suppose, of great danger and so on. And then finally when the police came, they have telephones on those buses so they can call the police. And they run off then into their neighborhood there and no one get them. And I'm thinking to myself, well, what does one expect? Here are these kids, they don't have any chance to get a job. I mean, they don't have any real opportunities. They're imprisoned in this world. They grow up in a world of violence like that. In other words, at that point, one can respond with a sort of there, but for the grace of God to go I, or one can move, it seems to me, in another direction where one tries to feel with them or crawl behind their eyes and tries to get some sense of why this situation exists or why these kids would be on this bus doing this mugging there. Well, anyway, we look at our own society and these inequities and we start to think of compassion, and it seems like that has to be part of the analysis. Let me look at that cultural analysis in another way, and from the viewpoint of competition. Matthew Fox, in his book on compassion, makes a big thing of looking at competition as the great enemy of compassion. Heard a lecture this afternoon on conflict resolution, managing conflicts. And the man was trying to tell us some very healthy, good things about in any situation. We're in a win-lose situation, both lose, one win, or both win. And he says, we got to get to a situation, conflict management, where there will be two winners, and so on. Well, my critique of the whole presentation is that the whole model for it is wrong. The whole analysis of how we're going to solve conflicts is put on the basis of win and lose. It's put on a success-failure thing. One of the things he said is that compromise in that kind of a situation will be felt as a loss. I think that's right. Someone in that views the human interaction in that way has got to say, if I end up compromising, I lose something. I can't do something I wanted to do. I can't have it my way in some way, therefore I lose. And my suggestion is that whole conflict resolution model needs to be rethought. that there's another way of thinking of human interaction, and compassion isn't a bad way of doing it. Compassion suggests a whole non-competitive way of interacting. I must say, as soon as I start talking like that, there's something else triggers inside of me. I grew up loving athletics. All of my life, that's been an important part of it. I can't talk about competition in a totally negative way. It's not possible. My father would come back and haunt me. It's not possible for me to talk that way. And therefore, I'm on alert to being careful about putting competition down too much. Okay, my reflections article this week is on the use of power. And I'm sort of defending the fact that competitive power is a necessary part of life. That one can't get away from it. So I would maybe distinguish, following some others, an assertive kind of interaction, an assertive competitive attitude, where one would call on one's best efforts, would try to refine one's argument and debate, would try to see that one's own plan of action gets implemented, would be willing to fight for a position and so on, but not with the idea of destroying the other or defeating the other. Well, not with that in mind, which I would label an aggressive kind of competition. So it seems to me, I believe in sort of a healthy kind of competition. However, the cultural problem is that isn't the way it works. That we've built up a whole idea of getting to be number one by defeating the other. No, it's not good enough somehow to assert one's own best, to do one's own best. It is important to defeat the other, maybe even to destroy the other. And so, we get that sense of the basketball game, get that 100 points and sort of maybe humiliate the other team. It scores now 98 to 54, and the crowd's going crazy to get the... there is the sense built into the culture where it is pushing the other person down. One has to be number one. One does that by defeating the others. I think we see that in the whole problem of nationalism, which becomes so important in this analysis. Our country has to be number one. Someone was analyzing the Olympics in this regard. The tradition of the Olympics was where the individual athlete went and competed. And there was, I think, a marvelous idea of competition that exists in the best of the Olympic spirit. There's a certain comradeship that's developed and a sense of competing for its own sake, going against one's own limitations and so on. But what has happened, of course, in our own time is that the Olympics have taken another thing. That is, it becomes one nation against another. It becomes a political kind of struggle. Politics get mixed in with all of that. How many medals does the nation have in order to be able to defeat the other ones? We keep track of that, which is, of course, was opposed to the whole spirit of the Olympic Games at one time. So that what happens, it seems to me, is this aggressive kind of competition takes over our mentality. And we can see it in us having to be superior in armaments. Our way of life has to be seen as superior to every other way. Our sense of beauty, our music, our governmental system, our economic system, that has got to be the best, and somehow is the only way that the rest of the world could run. You see it at that sense of the national level. I think then that comes down within our own country, where you get a very competitive spirit going between various groups. We even get it between churches, and it works its way down to the individual level, where people feel bad about themselves because they can't be number one. Where athletics, instead of helping someone to grow and develop and compete against themselves, ends up being the kind of thing that hurts. So many people are embarrassed by that, or put down, or feel worthless because they cannot compete at the same level. And I've talked to parents saying, my youngster, he's not strong, and he's really not very graceful, and he can't compete well, and he really feels crummy about himself. And how we know all of the problems that seem to result from that. Again, we live in a society where this competition is the main way we think of life and what life is all about. Now, it seems as though what is needed is to replace that competitive kind of notion, replace the privatizing tendency with what I call a political economic compassion. So that if we're going to really help the suffering and be with the poor in the world, part of our effort has to be at changing structures. Making institutions more just, attacking systemic evil. We have to become more aware of that. That's the premise that an organization like Bread for the World runs on. I often use that as an example because it seems so helpful. In other words, Bread for the World tries to lobby Congress. It tries to get members, pay your $15 a year, write your congressperson to get laws passed that relate to hunger in our world. So we get a food bank set up so that more aid would be given to people in a starving country. You start to think like that, and you think about what can be done with the change of one law. It would be impossible for all the people around to really touch as many individuals as the change of one law can. One governmental action that could shift the resources in the world. That's an example of what I would say of dealing with a politicized kind of compassion that sees the structural evil in the world. I think that the compassion that we need today is rooted in the global village, where we begin to see that we are all on this spaceship Earth, and that nations are interdependent. Einstein called for a long time ago, along with a lot of other voices, but I pick him because he's a heroic figure to many people. Einstein said the only real hope for the human race these days is an overarching political economic structure that could call nation-states to task. Our bishops in the Peace Pastoral call for the same thing. A world view. Now that's idealistic today. People can't even begin to think about that, I suppose. But a politicized compassion has got to start to think like that, where we are in this one boat. The nuclear threat today just makes that more real. We're either going to survive together or we're going to perish together. The idea of a total of competition with other nations just isn't going to work. Someone starts to think, just the building of one less weapon system, what that can mean in terms of resources left over for helping the poor in our world. When we go to our Christian tradition, we find there resources to think in this way. We have the notion given to us by Teilhard de Chardin of the cosmic Christ. Christ who is the Lord of the whole of the world. All the people are united to this one Christ. It's another way of saying Mother Teresa's vision, I think. That all of us are involved in this loving union with the Lord, who's the center of this whole cosmos of ours. We talk about the communion of saints. Communion of saints is a marvelous doctrine that says all the humans who have ever lived are intrinsically linked. All of us are touched by God's grace. All of us have that same spirit within us. Now that might sound like a strange thing to develop a political, economic kind of compassion, but it seems crucial to me. It seems that only when we get that global kind of vision are we then going to be in a position to do all the little tactical things that can help us to be with the poor, to help the suffering. Mother Teresa is a challenging figure. She doesn't have to have it all together. She doesn't have to have all the answers. She has one side of it developed in a marvelous, beautiful way that can inspire. It's heroic virtue. It's the virtue of personal compassion as we've seldom seen it in the history of the world. Surely that woman, 5 foot tall, dynamo, energetic, personally involved, can do wonders for us in trying to move us to be more compassionate people. I think the picture has to be filled out with this political and economic compassion that tries to fight structural and institutional evil as well. She has told us that those who are into that, fine, go to it. I think that's a good way of doing it. I want to thank you for your time and attention. Mother Teresa, and that people know or are taken with, or a lot of people have their own favorite stories, or any kind of direction. Yeah, Vivian? I hope people heard you. I think that the point of it is that one has to be careful that working at the institutional structural side of compassion doesn't depersonalize compassion and move us out of a compassionate stance. I think that's the essence of what I got out of what you said.
And is it possible to avoid it?
Oh. No, I think she adopts a healthy attitude, the same one I would want to adopt. It still strikes me that there is a pluralism of approaches to the Christian life, and that we need all kind of people. I don't see myself why we have to set up a competition between Mother Teresa and Agnes Mansour. You know? I don't know why people can't contribute to the well-being of the human community out of their own background, talents, and interests. That, it seems to me, the mistake is made on both sides. I mean, I think that the analysis of Dick Ryan is right, that some people do use Mother Teresa as a symbol of regressive kind of and reactionary position. Oh, that says that's what the American nuns ought to be doing. They shouldn't be in politics. Or that's what every Christian person ought to be doing. They shouldn't be involved in getting Father Drinan out of Congress. Oh, he ought to be out personally dealing with the poor. She's used that way. There's no doubt about that. That's a fact. Whether, in my sense of it, is the mistake is putting her off as the only way that one can be compassionate in the world, the only approach to the Christian life. And I believe that the real answer to this whole thing is to allow people to function as Christians in their own way, use their own insights and talents, and to celebrate all of that. I'm happy to have Agnes Mansour with Mother Teresa, and working at social justice, helping people each from their own angle. Now, to get the other part of attempt to respond to the other part of what you said, I believe you're correct that it becomes easy to take a hands-off policy to give your money to a charity and therefore to become a philanthropist if you got a lot of it, or a gift giver if you've got small amounts, and to lose what compassion is all about. And I think especially religious people are prone to that. Churchy people. There's a quote I wanted to use. There's a book by a fellow by the name of William Eckhart on compassion from a psychological viewpoint. And in there he has data to show that the average churchgoer has a less developed social consciousness than the average non-churchgoer. It plays into the problem here of saying, you're involved in an institution, and therefore you don't have to be somehow personally involved. That's a very frightening thing. But it also says, the other half of his research shows, that people who have deep-seated religious values have a higher social compassion quotient than people without those religious values. In other words, it seems as though if one has caught the spirit of the religion as a way of life, has caught the spirit of the founder, and isn't bogged down in the institutional side of it, that it functions well in the terms of the virtue of compassion. Otherwise, it doesn't seem to be all that helpful. In fact, perhaps negative. So, what I'm trying to do with that comment is reinforce the point, it seems to me, that we are in danger of institutionalizing it, depersonalizing it, and we must be on guard against that. Seems to be ways that people try to do that. I mean, one can imagine entering into a compassionate relationship with one other person. It's always struck me as being a sort of crucial for churchy type of people. It seemed to me that the problem has always been that, well, churchy type people, now we got all these people to help out there, we help everybody. We love everybody. Celibates, that's why we're not married. We love everybody. And it seems as though what it's easy to lead to is that one loves no one in particular. Therefore, one could imagine dealing with the problem in one's personal life. If I happen to think it's crucial to belong to the voluntary association, like Bread for the World, and I support organizations like that. The other side of it would seem that one ought to have one person that one relates to compassionately. That, seems to me, would be able to keep one in some sort of balance in life, and would be the way of getting around it. I don't think you can get around it theoretically, just by saying to oneself, well, compassion is two-sided. There's a marvelous way in which Mother Teresa is like the liberation theologians want us to be. That is, for her, practice is first. All flows from love of God. I don't want to get it around it. She says her vocation is to love the Lord. That's first. Her vocation is not to help poor people. But her love of the Lord flows into helping poor people and dying people. But she says that that's first. You don't theorize about it. You go up and pick up somebody off the street and help them. And I think that that's what the liberation theologians tell us, that practice is first, and any theory or speculation or theology has to come after that. So what I'm saying is that to fight the danger of depersonalization, institutionalization, I think we have to relate to one other person, at least. Maybe some people can relate to more than one. And some people, I think, do that like through being a big brother or a big sister. And they might give their money to Bread for the World, but on Saturdays they go pick up this lad, take that lad out, and play basketball with him. Then you've got this personal interaction that's going to be the thing that she moves us toward. Let me use that as a springboard and make a couple points, it seems to me, about what she was about. One thing is that she really doesn't go out and solicit money. In fact, she refuses to do that. She's insistent that people decide to come to her to give it. She won't go out and look for it, and if you bring it to her and not on the right terms, she won't take it. She's pretty fussy about this, the way she reacts. That's one side of it. She's never out looking for money. If you decide you want to give it to her, with no strings attached, fine. Or give food. The other thing is that I notice in her analyses of the Western world is that there is a kind of poverty of the spirit here. She talks a lot about the people who die not on the streets of Calcutta, but who die in their own nice homes with no one around them. Alienated, lonely. She has a great feel for that other side of it, the spiritual alienation. At the same time, she talks a whole lot about both the corporal works of mercy, helping other people bodily, feeding and clothing, also the spiritual works of mercy, sort of comforting. And I think she said that in a talk in London. You got more people here that need help. And as we know, that orders of her nuns, I don't have the most up-to-date statistics. I quoted the last thing I could find, that 90% of the women in her order are Indians. And they then come to the United States, the big cities, to help the poor, but I think also to help the alienated. that is spiritually, psychologically alienated. Oh, there's so much just dawning on me. It's the point that I don't want to miss about her compassion, being with. I don't know how this escaped me before, but her being with frees her from compulsion. That's right. That's the whole other part of the talk I wanted to give, was compassion in relationship to compulsion. Compulsion. And just to pick up one compulsion she doesn't have, and that is the compulsion to baptize people or convert them. Oh, yeah, there's a whole story I was meant to tell about it. When she first came, found her house in Calcutta, it was next to this temple to Kali, a goddess. And in there, I guess a lot of derelicts had sort of taken over, and they really gave her a bad time. And a part of it was that they thought she was trying to convert people to Christianity, like all the other missionaries who came there. And they used to throw stones at their place and attack them and so on. They were even, I guess, out to get her. One story says they were going to try to kill her. She got word of it and in characteristic fashion walked right over to them and said, here I am if you want to kill me. No, go ahead. Took them on. But then at the same time, shortly after, one of the priests in that particular monastery there fell very ill and had leprosy, and they wanted to throw him out, I guess, and she picked him up, took him over to her place, and took care of him until he died. She, in these dying people, they never try to convert them. In fact, they're talking about bringing the water of the Ganges there to put on the lips of the Hindus as they are dying. A sacred ritual for them, the Ganges being their sacred river. And doing that ritual for them. In fact, I meant to ask Eileen Egan this, and I didn't get the chance, but Mother Teresa's toyed with the idea for many years of bringing Hindus into her order. She really wants to do that. The woman is ecumenically minded in an odd way. I mean, she really, I don't think she feels the differences. Her compassion, her ability to be with, undercuts those things. She feels no compulsion to baptize these people, no need to convert them, only to comfort them as they die, to be with them. A marvelous ministry. Well, what ticked that off? Compulsions, I think. A whole lecture on compulsions and how at least that compulsion sees undercut. That, yes. Everything that's written about her is really a hagiography. It's a saint's thing. There's no critical biography of her, no way of knowing. I'm sure there is. We just don't know it. And, no one walks around perfect, So, we don't have the tools, the resources. And it's going to be very hard to find because she is so insistent on covering up everything. There's no biographies to be written. She won't tell the stories. Other people are told not to tell the stories, and so on. The most you get in any of these people talking about her is her stubbornness. Some people say she's a very poor business person, doesn't know how to handle money. Others say she doesn't answer her mail. People say she doesn't say thank you, send a thank you note for stuff she's received. Someone else said, how are you going to work from 4 o'clock in the morning till late at night and then answer mail? Some say she doesn't know how to organize. I pick up, if you want something from my viewpoint, is a bit of authoritarianism. She runs that with an iron hand. And you can tell there's a maternalism about it, seems to me. She ran the Order of Brothers for 3 years before a man took over. Eileen was telling me today about reverse chauvinism. Wasn't that what you were saying? I must, as I tried to read critically, that's there. It was saying about decision making. You get that, the nuns will say, oh yeah, she involves us in all the decision making. I sort of doubt that. reading the way some things happen. The question was, would they have a washing machine? And, she brought it up to the whole group. One could almost tell by the story how she brought it up. They weren't going to get a washing machine. I don't care if 90% of the nuns wanted a washing machine. They weren't going to have one. They were going to wash their own clothes. On the other hand, she decided that having a telephone would be a good thing to do. And therefore, they have a telephone. The nuns say that those are group decisions. They don't sound that way to me. There's a lot of fear about what will happen after she goes. When you read these things and you think back to what we read or talked about Orwell last time about leader worship, I would say there is a danger of that. The way they talk about mother and so on, I would think that they're going to be in trouble in some way when she dies. The second in command is a very timid kind of person. It's hard to imagine her assuming that kind of leadership. I must say I flashed on a lot of things about Cesar Chavez and as I was reading about her and some of the things that we began to find out about the farm labor movement and Chavez's dealings with his people and so on. You get mixed stories on that. I suspect that those will come out somewhere along the line. But you get a fanatic almost devotion to her now. No one's going to say anything bad about her in the way things stand now. I don't think Eileen Egan's biography it's listed as a definitive biography, but it won't be either. She's been a friend of hers since 1950. She was with her in Oslo, Norway, when she received the Nobel Peace Prize, and she has the same kind of awe in relationship to her. The woman, is magnificent. She's a saint. I think she comes as close as anything we've seen in our time. I look for things with Gandhi. Gandhi died, in 47, right after the partition. And Mother Teresa really got into action about 48. So she would have been in the convent there from 36 to 47, right all through the time when Gandhi was so active. I really haven't found any interaction. Maybe someone else will. Can't pin that down. I just would guess they would have had to have thought of one another or somehow been involved. Interesting comment. One of the things I picked up in the reading about her was the cultural difference. She became a citizen of India and began, I think, she's a friend of Mrs. Gandhi, and I think that Indian leaders began to think of her as really thinking like an Indian. I think she's one of the few examples of someone maybe who could really adopt an Eastern mentality. But that mentality there, is so different from ours in terms of individualism. When they write about how these people die, there's no great movement to overcome this problem on the part of the impoverished group. These people who live on the streets simply accept that that's the way they're doing it. They're not railing against it. Why doesn't the government help us? Or how are we going to get out of here? Or go do something else. That isn't part of their mentality. It's hard for us to imagine. We think of a person in that situation and say, how can I improve this? They don't seem to think that way. They are geared spiritually and through their religious convictions and so on to accept, to be passive passive in the face of that, to learn to endure. That really is the virtue that is celebrated. Now, I think when you start to put yourself in that different cultural milieu, I think it becomes more possible to think of living without what we would think are the ordinary complements to a full personality. I'm not so sure it's that important to them. I think you're right about the aesthetics of their situation. I mean, they live right in, places, you've probably seen the pictures, but there isn't any space. I guess part of our sense of freedom is developed because we live in a big country with a westward movement and space. They don't have any of that sense of space. I mean, they are always next to somebody. They don't have any problem with that. I mean, that's just normal. These beds, when you look at these pictures, the beds are all real low to the floor, a few inches off the floor so people don't fall out and hurt themselves. And they are just one next to the other. You can't go in between and try to comfort the person. These pictures you see, the sisters are standing out here. The beds are lengthwise like this, trying to somehow minister to them. People are on top of one another. The sisters, I think, live in that same kind of situation. And I just have to think that their whole sense of what freedom is and individuality and fulfillment is so totally different that I'm not sure they're adversely affected. A lot of that has to do with our expectations. That's the whole business of rising expectations. Let's face it, women lived in traditional marriages for a lot of years without ever feeling put down, without ever feeling the need to revolt or that this isn't right or I want more. That's just the way it was. Priests lived in crummy rectory situations. Just did it because that's what one was expected to do. It's only when someone tells you or you experience, hey, it could be different, that your consciousness is raised. They don't have raised consciousness about that kind of thing. And all of the reports you read say, Malcolm Muggeridge is a good example. I think I put in the notes he was an agnostic. He's really a converted person. I don't know at what point. And I read a conversion of his that didn't link it to Mother Teresa at all. I had thought in my mind that it was converted to Christianity because of his encounter with Mother Teresa. He's the one who made her famous in a way. They went in, I'm thinking, 1969, they went and did that documentary film, Something Beautiful for God. That's her constant phrase. We in Ministry of the Poor get to do something beautiful for God. The poor do something beautiful for God. And so that's the title of the documentary and the title of Muggeridge's book. I was always under the impression he was converted by his interaction with her. I've read since that it occurred in another context. Be that as it may, he was one of all these people who go there who are agnostic or don't believe and going to interview Mother Teresa and so on. They come away changed. They are different people. They look at the world differently. Conversions happen just by being in the woman's presence. I don't think any doubt we were dealing with a holy person, a person close to God, and a person who is integrated in the sense that her life goes along with her theology in a way. It's all peace. Her being and her person are lived out in a way that's integrated. I think that's why she can keep going. I don't think she's in conflict. If you can't stand nursing homes, nursing homes are hard for me. When I go to visit the nursing homes, I come out, I'm worn out. If I had to visit the nursing home, 3 times every day, I couldn't do anything else. I'm out. And that's all within. Nothing happens there that, it's because one isn't in tune with that kind of service. Whereas maybe I can do some other kind of ministry and do it for hours and hours and say, how can you keep going? We all know that our own way. It's when we feel integrated with what she's integrated with what she does. That's why I think she's able to sustain the effort. the people who visit say that about her and the other sisters. They're joyful. They radiate. They're happy people. They talk in a positive way. They're joyful while taking care of these people. You know, I mean, these agnostics, there's all kind of people who wanted to go there and bust this bubble. And that doesn't happen. They go there with that in mind, or this realistic documentary or something, and they come away being believers in what's going on. That makes me think that these people are integrated. See, we got this notion that, especially in our culture today, that you can only get integrated by having all kinds of experiences. You know, if you're missing this chunk of experience, you're unfulfilled. When you're missing this part of it, then you're truncated in some way. And that's become part of the culture now, and people buy into it more and more. Thus the desperate search for more experience. And yet, I think the people living in another culture just don't think like that. They don't have rising expectations. So I don't think it's a problem. They get it out of the mass, the Eucharist. People are saying that when they watch Mother Teresa put a mass, they say it's an amazing experience. That the impression some people get is she's got a palpable hunger for the Eucharist, like a hungry person would have for food. She needs that nourishment. Well, and she talks that way too. I think that's where they get it, and that's sort of true.
What about the missionary brothers of charity and their work in the United States?
Well, I don't know a lot about them. I put down there, I noticed one fact, they had 4 houses in Los Angeles. They generally follow a lot of the same things. I mean, it came with this sister founded them, and Mother Teresa founded them to begin with because there were certain things she thought men ought to be able to do, take care of some of the dying boys and so on, and teaching some of the boys, and felt that, you know, they would be a valuable part of it, and men started coming to her, and so they formed this small group, and she guided them and so on. Eventually this brother Andre, who was an Australian priest, came and then took over and became the leader. Well, they seem to have I get the impression that they're not as strict. You know, I think that, and for example, when you see the pictures, all the nuns dress the same way. In these saris, they dress with it. Someone had pointed out that Mother Teresa is calling upon sisters to wear distinctive garb in the United States when she wears the garb of all the other people. She wears the Indian sari like all the other women in India do. She adopted that. But the brothers don't have a standard dress. It seems like they feel freer in that regard. They do the same kind of work, live in the slums, and try to help people out. They're much smaller. It hasn't grown in the same numbers anywhere near the way the women have flocked to it. I don't know what else to say about it. Maybe other people know. Other houses, they got houses in Los Angeles, but I don't know where else. New York, I guess, too. Chicago? Anybody else know anything about them? Will help fill out the picture? Missionary brothers. Oh, yeah. Rubbing shoulders and funny. Really? Well, I mean, that's the kind of thing that can excite me, you know. I mean, everyone has an intuitive response like, wow, you know, why not? Terrific idea. You go by experience we have in the United States. I mean, the way we've broken down prejudice simply by being with one another. Different backgrounds in this country. And maybe you got to start with the young before they learn all these prejudices and hatred. Sounds terrific. Also, you know, that brings up a point. I mean, I'm not so sure she's so, I want to say, unorganized or without guile as people say, or as her followers seem to indicate. That strikes me as an example. I mean, it seems to me the woman is thinking, like, what can we do? You know, how do we, it's not just on an ad hoc basis. I mean, she had in mind this leper colony, for
for example. She had her eye on some property, I think. And she had this idea she could build this leper colony, then they could work there, and now they're outcasts, of course, in the society, and they could take care of one another and grow some food there, and she pulled that off. But it's an example to me as maybe she's more institutionalized than one might first think. And this idea of just let God provide on a day-to-day basis, I got a feeling like she's got her own ideas in there a little bit more. That school thing reminds me of that side of her. That she had plans and ideas about how she could help the poor. Yeah, Irish order, yeah. That's right, she lived in Ireland during the novitiate. Yeah. That's where she learned English, as a matter of fact. One day, Mother said, I don't know why I fight them, but that smile, you see the pictures all the time. I mean, there's something infectious about that smile of hers. Right? It really speaks, I think, a lot of what's in her heart, what she's all about. Isn't somebody going to ask me about the political side of this? Yeah. Pretty passionate about that. I mean, you almost, in a sense,